Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's message. I'm Eric, the lead pastor of South Mountain Community Church. Thank you for taking just a bit of your time to be with us today. We exist for one reason, and that's to help as many people as possible take their next step towards becoming fully devoted and fully delighted followers of Jesus Christ. And I know that for so many people, church and even religion can be messy and oh so complicated, but it doesn't have to be that way. Here you can belong before you believe. So our hope is that your first visit with us is enjoyable, meaningful, and unlike the church experiences of your past. We also think that the best way to experience delight is with others in person. So SMCC is about more than just a Sunday sermon. We have 5 locations for you to choose from where you can connect with people in authentic community. We want every message you hear to engage your head, your heart, and your hands for a life of full delight. So with all of that in mind, enjoy today's message.
I just want to say thanks for joining us today. And if I could, I'd like to open up with a quick question for you all. And it's pretty simple. It's just this. Have you ever suffered the same injury over and over again? Because I have. For example, real quickly, just given the flyover, when I was in 6th grade in gym class, I hopped onto one of those snowboards that used to have the string attached, and you grabbed onto the handle and you jumped on. I haven't seen one of those in a store for about 20 years, probably because of trying to avoid legal reasons. But basically, I went down the hill, and when I got to the bottom, I had my first hairline fracture. About a year and a half later, I was playing soccer, and I broke the other wrist and didn't finish that game. My final organized game of soccer, didn't even get to finish it. Had to make a quick trip to the ER. And then about a dozen years later, 2 days before our second child was born, our son, I was playing intramural basketball at a Bible college, which gets a little more aggressive than you would expect. And I'll admit, I was playing some sloppy defense, and I collided with another player and came up with a broken wrist, and this time it was more than just a hairline fracture. A guy actually worked up a sweat trying to get the bones back into place, and I'm not sure he ever fully got it, but I appreciated the effort and what they gave me so that I didn't feel what I should have been feeling at the moment. But all that to say, I have broken my wrists several times throughout my life, and because of that, every time I do, for example, if I was to break my wrist tomorrow, I know exactly what's involved in the healing process. It's a quick trip to the ER for some x-rays. They put a cast on it. And then basically for the next 6 weeks, I just stock up on garbage bags and duct tape, because for every shower I take, I have to duct tape a garbage bag around my arm and hold it up high, which is a super fun thing. But there's no guesses, right? There's no questions, there's no wondering what's involved in this. I know exactly what the healing process looks like, which makes it easier, because healing is easier when you understand the process. And here at SMCC, we've been going through and are actually bringing to a close today this series called Triage. That's been all about how to survive a spiritual emergency. And I think one of the things that makes spiritual emergencies so challenging, so disorienting and difficult is that it's a healing process that is unclear, that is fuzzy, that is muddled, that you don't know what the steps are that are involved in rebuilding a life on truth and in healing after a spiritual emergency. And the goal for this series has been to really lay out what that process looks like, what the steps are that are involved. And so we talked about step 1 being keep breathing. Basically, just keep doing the things that are sustaining your life and your health, that are giving you time and the chance to heal and to process. Step 2 is all about finding the right people who can provide you with the care and the support that you need in the midst of a time like that. Steps 3 and 4 are closely interconnected. They're all about learning how to think, asking the right questions first, because I think in a spiritual emergency, it's easy for our minds to kind of race in a million different directions and with a million different questions, and they all feel so urgent and so important, and yet focusing on the questions that are foundational to how we think and rebuilding a life on truth is important. And so we talked about that in weeks 3 and 4, and rebuilding a life on truth. And now today, what we're looking at is the final step in the process, which is really moving beyond the process into life after it. But the question I want to explore together this morning is just this. Once you've stabilized yourself after a spiritual emergency, how do you keep moving forward? What does life look like on the other side? And to get at that, I want to look at three smaller questions that are wrapped up within it and unpack each of those together. The first one being, well, what does health look like? What is the target? What's the destination? If we're going to keep moving forward, what are we moving forward to? So what does health look like? Number two, how do we get there? What does the process look like? What are the steps along the way? And then the third one is, what can I do today? Because you can't make the whole journey in a day or in a week or even in a year, but what can we do today to move towards greater spiritual health? And so those are the three questions. What does health look like? How do we get there? And what can we do today? And that's what I want to work through together this morning. So jumping in with that first one, what does health look like? I think one helpful way to look at it, one helpful angle on it, is that health is the capacity to enjoy. Health is the capacity to enjoy something. And I think if you look at different areas of life, from the physical to the financial to so many different things, that when there is health, we have the capacity to enjoy those things and really to enjoy the rest of our life through those things in a broader way. And yet when health is lacking, when there's non-health in those areas, what is reduced, what's taken away is our capacity to enjoy those things and even the rest of life because of it. And so one really helpful way I think of understanding health is as the capacity to enjoy. And that applies even to the spiritual. That spiritual health is the capacity to enjoy God and even to enjoy the rest of life through Him. That spiritual health, pursuing that is one of the greatest ways to really maximize your amount of joy, the joy that you take in life on the day today. But the question is, and you break that down, what really are the components of spiritual health? And I want to look at that together here in some of the nuts and bolts. So Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 to 20. This is Jesus speaking, and He says something here to His disciples that I think is particularly helpful for our question this morning. Very close of the book of Matthew, and He says this: "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples." Make disciples is the command within the passage. That's what He's telling them to do. And then He goes on to unpack that. Make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. All right, so make disciples is the command. And He unpacks that with these two phrases of baptizing and teaching. And with the second one, teaching, what He's saying is teach them how to live the life that I have invited you into. Right, that teach them how to live in that particular way that is for your good, for your health, and for your joy. And baptism is actually related to that and connected to it, particularly because baptism is an expression of placing trust in Jesus as the ultimate authority within a person's life, as the one who defines your identity, and as the one who directs your activity. And here at SMCC, we actually have language for getting at that in a particular way, for describing what this spiritual health looks like. And it's full devotion and full delight that we talk about in this way. Full devotion is authority, identity, and activity. I delight in submitting to what God says and not what I say. I delight in defining myself by what Jesus has done for me, not in what I do. In activity, I delight in doing for others what Jesus has done for me. And the order here is significant, that it starts with authority and then identity and then activity. Because I think the truth is that no matter where we're at this morning, no matter where you're coming from, every single one of us, we're all devoted to something. Whether that's in a religious sense where we have an understanding of certain boxes that we need to check, and as long as we check those, then we get sort of the approval from God that we're looking for, and we can be ensured of kind of what we're looking for both in this life and in the next one. Or, you know, it's in a kind of an irreligious sense where maybe we're pursuing a particular way of life. I want to get into this school and graduate from this program and get a job in this field and kind of win approval in this way. But no matter what, we're all devoted to something. And usually our devotion flips this structure where we start with activity. That if I can just perform well enough in this life, in this way or in that way, if I can perform well enough, then I will achieve and craft an identity that demonstrates my worth and my value. It shows why I am worthy of respect, of love, of being honored, of being cherished, even of being delighted in. And so I win that from some authority that matters to me. We're all devoted to something, and so many of us have the tendency to approach life in this particular way. Activity, and then identity, and then authority. But you can see how that's an incredibly fragile way to live your life. And even in the context of this series, we see that with spiritual emergencies, where essentially what takes place in a spiritual emergency is you discover that the truth you built your life on isn't actually true. And in a moment, your trust in that authority is shattered completely. So you lose the authority, but not only that, all of a sudden you lose your identity as well, which was bestowed upon you by that authority. So you lose your sense of identity, your sense of purpose, your sense of direction in life. It all comes crumbling down, which is why they can be so disorienting. And that's why what Jesus invites us into in the reverse is so particularly helpful. Because instead of having to perform for someone who is our authority, instead we start with the authority who is fully devoted to us and to our good and is fully delighted in us as well. Right? Not devoted to us and disappointed in us, not wishing we were better, not frustrated with us, but delighted in you as you are today. And that defines your identity as someone who is worth being devoted to, as someone who is worth being delighted in. And then your activity, basically what makes up your life Monday through Friday, can flow from that freely. Not an effort to define yourself, not an effort to prove your worth, not an effort to try and win the approval or love of some authority, because you already have it. But living in a way that simply honors and expresses love in response to the love and the delight that you have already received from him. And that's why moving forward involves trusting Jesus as your authority who defines your identity and directs your activity. It's a realigning of these things, a changing of the order, starting with authority and then identity and then activity. And so that's some of our kind of core language at SMCC when it comes to talking about spiritual health and what it looks like to be fully devoted and fully delighted ourselves in the life that Jesus has invited us into. But we also have some other language that pairs with it as well that comes from this passage in Ephesians chapter 4. And I want to touch on that as well. So Ephesians 4, this is written by the Apostle Paul, a significant leader in the early church. We've actually traced his story throughout this series because he went through his own spiritual emergency. And in this letter, he's writing to the churches that are located in the city of Ephesians, located in what's now modern-day Turkey. And he's talking to them about spiritual health and maturity. And this is what he says, Ephesians 4:11. He says, "So Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and teachers to equip his people for works of service," for the church to be equipped. He goes on to say, "so that the body of Christ, the church, may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. Then we will no longer be infants tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind and teaching and by the cunning and craftiness of people in their deceitful scheming." He's saying there's a groundedness and a security that comes with spiritual health and maturity. He says, "Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ." It's a description of spiritual health within a church community. And you can see that he's getting at certain categories within this that lead us to having adopted really this language of wanting to equip people in the areas of head, heart, and hands. Right? Head being sort of biblical and theological maturity, being able to basically open up the Bible and read it and understand and know who Jesus is and who he is as the ultimate authority in all of reality. Heart being emotional and relational maturity, being able to move through our relationships as they're continually shifting and changing through life and navigating them well, speaking the truth in love. And then finally, hands is role maturity, knowing how to follow Jesus well in all of the roles, all of the responsibilities that make up our lives Monday through Friday, that are constantly shifting, constantly changing. The question being, how do we follow Jesus well in each and every one of them? Now, what it looks like to take that core of authority, identity, and activity and continue to really move that forward in our lives is to continually be equipped in head, heart, and hands in these three categories that we all see laid out in this passage describing spiritual health. And so that is health, right? Which leads to this capacity to enjoy God and this capacity to enjoy all of life as we have it. So that's what it is. The question is, how do we get there? All right, so a couple months ago, I had a couple of friends of ours. They actually gifted us something that they were going to throw away. So I don't know if that still counts as a gift, but in our book it is. It was a fish tank. They had a fish tank, they'd had to go for it, and they decided it wasn't for them. And so they're like, hey, do you want this? We're gonna get rid of our fish tank. And I was like, yeah, absolutely. I've always wanted a fish tank. I just never wanted to buy one. And so I will gladly take one for free. And over the past couple of months, there's been a heavy learning curve in what it looks like to actually have a fish tank. And so just if I could show off some of my fancy new terminology, we bought a nutrient-dense substrate for the bottom of the tank. That way the plants have everything they need. We got some fast-growing and some slow-growing plants just to kind of keep things balanced, and planted them in the foreground and in the background. And then we got some biological media for the bacteria to live on as part of the filtration system. And I don't really know what these things mean. I just read them in a book somewhere, saw them on YouTube. And then after letting the nitrogen cycle run its course, after a couple of weeks, we introduced some neon tetras to their brand new home. And it has been great. Although, if I'm completely honest with you, we have conducted a funeral or two along the way. Which I'll say this. There's a combination of two things. Finding Nemo claims that all drains lead to the sea, and the New Testament says that at the end of the age, the sea shall give up her dead. So I feel like that's warrant for us in terms of having sort of a little fish funeral. I don't know, maybe that's more Pixar than anything. But the point is, with the fish tank, what I've learned is that it is far more difficult to keep this little 3.5 gallon tank healthy than what I had ever expected. And it's because in order to pursue health, you have to know what produces it. And the same is true spiritually. If you want to grow spiritually, you have to know what produces spiritual health. You have to know what the factors are, what the catalysts are, what leads to greater spiritual health within our lives. And pastor and author Andy Stanley, he has talked about there being 5 really key spiritual growth catalysts, 5 things that consistently across the board seem to be significant factors in spiritual growth in people. And to the point where, he would probably say if we were to, even in this room, break up into little groups, kind of huddle up and talk about what are the most significant things that have contributed to each of our own spiritual growth, chances are every single thing we say, every one of us says would fall into one of these 5 categories. And so they're not really a list that you find anywhere within the Bible per se, and yet they do seem to be consistently factors in spiritual growth. So I just want to walk through them together. So 5 catalysts for spiritual growth. The first one is practical teaching. Practical teaching. Basically just teaching that is from the Bible, that is understandable, that's practical, that's hopeful and helpful. It communicates truth from the Bible that you can then take and apply and build your life on, right? Just really simple. Number 2, providential relationships. Basically mentors or friend groups that we have been introduced to and become a part of, or even spouses that we've entered into relationships with that have been such significant catalysts for our own spiritual growth. Third one being private disciplines, things like having a regular time in the Word and in prayer. Actually, if I can kind of combine number 2 and number 3, when I first came to faith, when I first trusted Jesus when I was about 19 years old, there was an older gentleman in the faith, a former hippie who had found Jesus, who was a mentor to me initially. And a few of the things he challenged me to do were to begin having a regular time reading the Bible and praying on my own and even giving to the church. And those were some really significant things for my own spiritual growth that I was thankful to have been challenged on, to be invited into, and that have stuck with me ever since then. So private disciplines. Number 4, personal ministry. This one's kind of interesting because when you jump into ministry, either as a small group apprentice or leader, or you're serving in the children's ministry or whatever it might be, I think a lot of times that can be an experience where we come face to face with, man, I think I'm in water that's over my head here. And all of a sudden you start leaning into your relationship with God saying, can you help me figure this out? Because I need to figure this out. And so personal ministry can serve in a really helpful way there as well. And the fifth and final one is pivotal circumstances. Pivotal circumstances. These can be good things, right? That I think a consistent one in a lot of people's lives is they have their first child. And for some reason, people have the sense that I think God should be a part of this kid's life, and yet I don't know a whole lot about God, and pretty sure you don't know a whole lot about God, so maybe we need to find some people who know something about God. And that can serve as a catalyst for the whole family's spiritual growth. It can be something really good like that. And at the same time, pivotal circumstances can fall into the more difficult category of life. Things like the loss of a loved one, things like prolonged sickness and disease, things in the really difficult category can in a lot of ways be significant catalysts for spiritual growth. And I think there's a whole lot of people in this room who can testify to that reality. And actually, with the series being all about spiritual emergencies, I think we can also say that spiritual emergencies themselves are pivotal circumstances. Which is interesting because they feel more deconstructive and even destructive at first than anything, and yet they really can be such incredibly significant factors in our own spiritual growth. And that's because you see them falling under that core category, but even in addition to that, you see every one of these other factors playing out within them. For example, practical teaching and private disciplines, those are all about beginning to rebuild a life on truth. And so practical teaching helps you think through what are the most important questions. How do I learn how to think? How do I continue to build my life on truth? Right? Practical teaching and private disciplines are both wrapped up within that. You also see providential relationships. That's step 2 in the healing process, finding the people who are right for you, who are safe and can provide the care and the support that you need. When you find those people in the exact season and moment in life that you need them, that is a providential relationship that is there for your good, for your healing, and even for your growth. And so you see the first 4 in those ways, but the fifth one, personal ministry, even plays into it in a particularly interesting way. In 2 Corinthians chapter 1, the Apostle Paul, he says this. He says, praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, basically acknowledging that they had been through some suffering, they'd been through some difficulties, and that God had been there with them in that. But then he goes on to say this, he comforts us so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. For just as we share abundantly in the sufferings of Christ, so also our comfort abounds through Christ. The idea being that there's a purpose beyond your suffering. He's saying God was with you in your suffering. He was there for you, helping you find healing, helping you move forward, but yet there is still a purpose beyond your suffering, and it's that surviving a spiritual emergency gives you the ability to help others in their own. Because we can take the suffering that we have been through and then take that and have the ability to empathize with other people as they struggle through the very same thing. Now, that's not to say that you can't help someone if you haven't been through a spiritual emergency on your own, because there are plenty of people here who have done just that. And yet I think it's true to also acknowledge that there's a difference when you can talk about what it feels like to go through the disorientation of having your entire worldview crumble, of having everything you built your entire life on, from your understanding of reality to your family to your community, to have all of that fall to pieces and not know which direction to turn and where to go and how to move forward. There's a difference when you can tell someone about that and they can say, I understand, I know what you're feeling because I've been through the very same thing. And that's why I think spiritual emergencies, when you've survived one on your own, it opens up this unique ability to be able to come alongside other people in their own and to help them through it as well. And so with that, we see the fifth and final catalyst of personal ministry playing a really significant role, maybe not in spiritual emergencies, but on the other side of them in particular. And so when it comes to how do we get there, how do we get to spiritual health, how do we get to the place where we can increase our capacity for joy, that is the answer. Now the question is, what can I do today? What can I do this day? So I read this memoir a couple of years ago by Will Smith, and I know that things have been a little with the award show debacle, but this was prior to that. And I'll say honestly, I have enjoyed his career as an actor and as a musician all the way through. And this book, I thoroughly enjoyed listening to this memoir. And early on in the book, he lays out this story that has served really as the framework for his entire approach to life and his career. And the story is kind of funny. Basically, his dad wanted to have this brick wall built in the backyard, and so he assigned the responsibility of building the wall to Will Smith and to his brother. And early on, they're trying to lay the bricks, and they're a few bricks into it, and they're just like, this is gonna take us forever. They're looking at how long they've worked and how far they've gone, and it isn't very far at all, and they've got so much further to go. They're like, this is gonna eat up our whole summer. We're gonna be graduated before the time this thing is done. And while they're in the midst of kind of moaning and complaining, their dad walks into the backyard, and he overhears them, and with some colorful language that I'm not particularly allowed to use, at least not up here, he basically says to them, stop thinking about the wall. Forget about the wall. Just think about one brick at a time. That's all you need to do. Just focus on laying one more brick. And with that subtle shift in their focus, all of a sudden, what was an overwhelming task that was creating despair became something they were able to enjoy, to continue working on, and to eventually bring to completion. And the same thing is true. I think that approach is also helpful when it comes to spiritual emergencies and moving forward on the other side. That you move forward by taking one next step of trust at a time. Meaning you don't need to think about where you're gonna be in 5 years or in 10 years. You don't need to get all caught up in worrying about what that looks like. But the most helpful thing to focus on today is just what next step of trust can I take now? And to that end, we've actually created a tool just to kind of help with that. And if you're in a spiritual emergency, or if you're kind of on the other side of it and trying to get a sense, or even if you're at a place where you just feel kind of stuck and stagnant in your own spiritual walk, and you're trying to figure out, how do I continue to move forward? We actually created this survey that's just really simple. It has just 4 questions on it, just trying to get a sense of kind of where you're at in your spiritual walk and what would be the most helpful next step for you to take today. And so what I want to do is throw this QR code up on the screen. It should be in your notes as well. But you can scan this, and it'll take you right to that survey. 4 quick questions. And what this will do is it'll go to the campus leadership here at the Draper campus, and you can expect to hear from the campus leadership soon, and they'll follow up with you, basically reaching out with what the next step would be, or what a few next steps would be that would help you to move forward towards greater spiritual health and towards a greater capacity for joy in this life. Because again, the goal is not to focus on 10 years or 5 years or even a year from now, but just what is one next step of trust that you can take today. And if you have no idea what that is, this is a tool that's designed to really enable us to come alongside of you and to help you with that next step. And so I want to invite you to just take advantage of that opportunity. Now, as we kind of bring this series to a close, one of the stories that many of us have shared throughout are just different stories of physical emergencies that our kids have been through and that we've kind of walked with them through. And the story I shared from the opening of the series was of my son and our son, who got a gash on his knee one day when we were playing at the park. And it wasn't anything too serious. All it needed was really just a little bit of cleaning and some stitches, and he was fine and good to go. And yet, even with that, several years later, he still has a scar upon his knee. There's still a mark from the emergency that he went through. And I think the same is true of spiritual emergencies, that the scar may not be physical, You may not be able to see it in the same way, but I still believe it's absolutely true to say that there are scars from what you have experienced in the form of the memories and the reminders of what you have been through. And yet I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I don't think that's necessarily a terrible thing, because if you think about it, Jesus, he lived the perfect life that we couldn't. And then he gave his life on the cross for you and for I. And when he rose to life on the other side of that, in this body that will never be touched by death or sickness or anything like that ever again, one of the things that the New Testament makes incredibly clear is that he still had his scars from the crucifixion. The scars from what he went through were still there, which for all of eternity will serve as a reminder that the bottom line is Jesus chose to be wounded so that you could be healed. He chose to be wounded and to go through death and to find life on the other side so that you and I could find life on the other side of our own emergencies as well. So that a spiritual emergency doesn't have to be the end of your story. And that in some ways, the scars from that experience and that pain can even serve as reminders of the life you found on the other side and of the death he went into so that you could. Let's pray together. Jesus, we thank you for the time together this morning. Thank you for your word. Thank you for the chance just to dive into what spiritual health is, what it looks like, what the essential components of it are, and how we continue to move towards it in this life. And so I thank you that it's not something that we need to be overwhelmed about, that we don't necessarily have to make these drastic changes, and yet just taking one next step of trust at a time is a way that we can continue to move closer to you, to grow in spiritual health, to be equipped in our head, heart, and our hands, and to live in and enjoy this increasing capacity for joy in you and in this life. And so we thank you for the chance to walk through this series, and the chance even to walk alongside of other people in their own spiritual emergencies. We pray that it would be for their good and for your joy. In your name, amen.
Thank you so much for joining us for today's message and trusting us with your time. If you'd like to connect with one of our pastors or staff, you can easily do that by visiting smccutah.org/connect. When you fill out that quick form, they will get back to you within a few days and be able to connect with you. As well, if you'd like to know more about taking a next step at SMCC, you can easily look at what next steps we have by visiting smccutah.org/next steps. And lastly, if you found today's message both hopeful and helpful, I would encourage you to do maybe one of two things. First, you can share this message with someone that would find it helpful. And you can also choose to partner with us financially so that more people can see messages like this. You can find more information on what that looks like by visiting smccutah.org/give. Again, thank you for joining us today, and I hope to see you at one of our locations soon.